Welcome to today's podcast. We appreciate you joining us. For those of you that have been following our Beneath the Dirt series, last time we met we discussed the patriarchs Isaac and Jacob. Well, today we're going to talk a little bit about Joseph of Egypt. In fact, we're going to explore the story of one of the most beloved and powerful non-Egyptians to ever rule Egypt, the last of the favored patriarchs, Joseph of Canaan. Joseph, the firstborn of Rachel, the 11th son of Jacob, or Israel, lived 93 years in the land of the pyramids, in the land of the tombs, in the land of the pharaohs. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're going to begin with Genesis 34. This is a sad commentary on lust, revenge, and murder. Of significance is how quickly evil tends to lead to evil. In an effort to avenge Dinah's abuse, Simeon and Levi commit murder, and they're going to forfeit their opportunity for a favorable blessing by Dad. Listen to their blessing. Genesis 49, verses 5 and 6. Simeon and Levi are brethren, instruments of cruelty are in their habitations. O my soul, come not thou into their secret, unto their assemblies. Mine honor, be not thou united, for in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they dig down a wall. Cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. Well, in an effort to flee from what Jacob anticipated to be some retaliation for what was done by Simeon and Levi, the family journeyed to Bethel. Here God renewed his covenant and promise that Jacob shall be a great nation, and his name shall be Israel. Jacob continues south beyond the site of Jerusalem to a place called Ephrath. Ephrath means fruitful. Now today's Ephrath is actually Bethlehem. So here near Bethlehem, Rachel dies giving birth to a son. Before dying, she calls the son Benoni, and this means son of my affliction. But Jacob, in an effort not to be continually reminded of his first love's death, called the child Benjamin, son of my right hand. Now Rachel's burial site is found today in the western bank, near the northern entrance to the biblical city of Bethlehem. Rachel's tomb is considered to be the third holiest site in Judaism, and was a significant place of worship in ancient times. Jews from all over the world visit the site each year, headed on their pilgrimage. They pray at the tomb for good health, fortune, and the return of God's children to the promised land. But there is some debate today as to whether this site is authentic or not. There's a passage in Genesis 35 that reads, "And Rachel died and was buried in the way to Ephrath," which is Bethlehem. But a careful study of the biblical geography makes you wonder if that in fact was where she died. Jeremiah the prophet, who lived in the 7th century BC, alluded to Rachel's death and said that it occurred near Ramoth. Now, Ramoth is an area just north, not south, but north of Jerusalem. It's still on that same north-south route that Jacob followed, but it's in the tribal land of Benjamin. Jeremiah's placement of the tomb north of Jerusalem, close to Ramoth, is also supported by another clue. Found in 1 Samuel, it records that Rachel's tomb was in the territory of Benjamin. So that makes some sense. But Bethlehem is in the tribe of Judah. Near Ramoth are 5 huge stone structures. These structures have from ancient times been called Kabar B'nai Yisrael, the graves of the children of Israel. The local Arabs believe that this is the site of Rachel's tomb. The origin of these rectangular stone structures still remains a mystery today. In Genesis 35, verse 20, it says, "And Jacob set a pillar upon her grave," and that is the pillar of Rachel's grave unto this day. So, did Rachel die north or south of Jerusalem? We're not sure. Archaeology may someday find the answer to that question. Well, these are difficult times for Israel, or Jacob, and they seem to progressively get worse. You have the incident, as I've just described, of Simeon and Levi. And now you've got Reuben involved in a poor choice. In Genesis 35:22, it says, "And it came to pass, when Israel dwelt in that land, that Reuben went in and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine." Well, in Genesis 30, you'll remember that Rachel gave Jacob Bilhah, her handmaiden, to wife. Reuben's going to feel the result of this offense against Jacob when it comes time to give his blessing out. In Genesis 49:4, it says, "Reuben, thou art unstable as water. Thou shalt not excel, because thou wentest up to thy father's bed, then defilest thou it." Now, so much for the three eldest sons of Jacob and the decisions they made. Well, Isaac now dies at the age of 180. Isaac and Esau bury him with his ancestors in the cave of Machpelah. At this point in our narrative, the ancestry of Esau, the Edomite, is given. It reflects a strong tribal structure. With dukes. Dukes are the tribal chiefs. The Edomites are thought to be perhaps the first settlers in the cliffs and the caves around Petra in today's southern Jordan. Well, now begins our story that we want to focus on today, Joseph. Joseph the dreamer. Israel loved Joseph more than all of his children. He made for Joseph a coat of many colors. And I'm sure you've all heard the story before. So let me just reference a couple of the unique aspects of this narrative. Joseph is sent to from Hebron, to Shechem, and then from Shechem he ends up going to the Dothan Valley. He's there to check on his brothers and see how they're doing as they herd the sheep. Well, Joseph's young, he's about 17 years old, and he's already annoyed his brothers with his dreams of superiority, and to top it off, Dad obviously liked him the best. Well, the Hebrew word for coat of many colors is kenaset pasim. Kenaset pasim. And that can probably be more correctly translated to a tunic with long skirts and sleeves, a little bit like what you see in the picture. Of course, they conspire against him and sell him into slavery to a passing band of Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, the price of a slave. Well, centuries later, another man named Judas is going to sell another great person for the price of a slave. By then, the going price had increased to 30 pieces of silver. In Genesis 38, we have another sordid affair. Judah marries a Canaanite wife, Shua. Well, there goes the birthright. The first 4 sons of Jacob chose poorly. In this case, however, a genealogical truth is preserved. This is a really convoluted story, but I want to try and tell it to you. Judah had 3 sons by this Canaanite wife, Shua, and as the sons mature, Judah sets out to try and find wives for his sons. Well, Judah finds a wife for his firstborn son, a fellow named Er. Her name is Tamar. For various disturbing reasons, the first and second son die, and this leaves Tamar a widow. Now, Judah tells Tamar to wait until his third son is old enough, and then she is to marry him. In the meantime, Judah goes off to shear the sheep. Tamar waits, but it appears that Judah's third son is really not interested in her. Tamar decides she's going to put off the widow's garment, and she's going to the town square, to the open place where the harlots hang out. Judah comes along and sees her, and you can see where this is going to go. He doesn't recognize her because she has a veil. And to make a long story short, she conceives by Judah, her father-in-law, and has twins. Their names are Pharez and Zara. Now, there are a lot of issues with this story, none the least being that Judah went into a harlot, or so he thought. This story is told because it preserves a genealogical line. From this union would come the ancestry, if you can believe it, of David, king of Judah, and Jesus of Nazareth. It seems really odd to me that this particular chapter is dropped in our story of Joseph of Egypt. It seemingly has no connection with the drama of Joseph, or does it? Or does it? This unrighteous Judah story prefaces a righteous story, a story of virtue, integrity, and courage. It shows how two of God's chosen use or abuse their moral agency. Compare the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife with this Judah story, and I'm sure you'll see what I mean. Well, Joseph unjustly spends 2 years in prison. He interprets dreams. In Genesis 40, we find the dream of the butler, interpreted as, "Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head." Then there's the dream of the baker, interpreted as, "Yet in 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head." Oh, but then there's those last 3 words. "Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee." I choose to be the butler. Then there's Pharaoh's dreams, 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And I need to make a clarification here. The reference to ears and stalks in chapter 41 of Genesis, verse 22, is not corn. It sounds like corn. Corn is indigenous to America and was unknown during biblical times. So what you think is corn is really wheat. The evidence of this is the wheat that is found in the royal Egyptian tombs that date back to the Old Testament era. Well, Pharaoh said this of Joseph, found in Genesis chapter 41, "Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou." And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, "See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand, and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, "Bow the knee." And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or his foot in all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-Paneah, and he gave unto him wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Now, this is certainly worth highlighting. We want to really try to understand how much power and authority Joseph actually had in Egypt. "And according to thy word shall all my people be ruled. I will set thee over all the land of Egypt. Bow the knee." And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. "Without thee no man shall lift his hand or his foot in all the land of Egypt." And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. The power, the authority, and influence of our 30-year-old Joseph is unprecedented. Never had a non-Egyptian been given such a command. And yet today, there's no sign of him ever having existed in Egypt. Or is there? We're going to address this important question in just a little bit. Now a thought about Joseph's wife, Asenath. She was from the ruling Hyksos class. The Hyksos were a Semitic group of people who gained a foothold in Egypt in 1782 BC. They reigned from 1570 BC until 1570 BC. So they had a 300 or so year reign. Joseph lived between 1700 and 1600 BC. So during this period of time, referred to as the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. These Semitic people are from Noah's son Shem, and later became known as Caucasian. Well, Joseph has a great food storage plan. He stores 20% of all the food that is generated during the 7 years of plenty. During this time of plenty, Joseph also is blessed with 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. In Genesis 41, verses 50 and 52, it says, "And unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of the famine came, which Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bare unto him. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God said, He hath made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction." Well, as you know, on comes the famine, and here comes Jacob's sons to buy wheat. With a little trickery, disguised Joseph really does play this to the max. Soon the brothers are convinced that they are cursed for what they did to young Joseph in the wilderness. Now you remember Joseph was 17 years old when he was sold into slavery. That's Genesis 37:2. He's 30 years old as he stood before Pharaoh. Now add an additional 7 years of plenty and a couple of years of famine, and we find that Joseph had been parted from his brethren for over 20 years. Now that's a long time for the brothers to be contemplating the fate of young Joseph. Joseph finally relents and convinces the brothers that he is none other than that 17-year-old boy sold into slavery. But there's an important message that he shares with them relative to this experience, and it's found in Genesis 45:7. And God sent me before you to preserve you posterity in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. Well, Joseph saved the Abrahamic covenant given to the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and now Joseph. Well, Pharaoh is overjoyed to have Joseph's entire family of 70 move to Egypt. Joseph told his brothers when Pharaoh asked them what their occupation was to tell him they're shepherds. The Egyptians find shepherds to be an abomination, probably because of the Hyksos kings, or pharaohs, shepherd kings as they're referred to. But by doing this, the Egyptians would leave the family alone. They said that there's no place to pasture the flocks because the famine was so great, and so Pharaoh then told Joseph that since they're his relatives, that they could use the best land in Egypt. Let them stay in the land of Goshen. He also told Joseph that since they were skilled shepherds, they can be in charge of Pharaoh's cattle. Joseph then introduced Pharaoh to his father Jacob. Pharaoh asked Jacob how old he was, and Jacob said he was 130 years old. He said his years had not been as long as his father's, and he had been able to see much evil during his time. Jacob then blessed Pharaoh. Well, as the famine grew worse, Joseph devised a rather unique plan to solve a problem that surfaced. The people said, "We have no money to buy food." The answer given, "Sell your cattle, and I will give you food." The people said, "We have no money, we have no cattle to buy food." The answer, "Sell your land, and I will give you food." The people said, "We have no money, no cattle, and no land to buy food." The answer, "Here is seed, sow it in the land, and I will give you food. Of all that ye reap, give a fifth part to Pharaoh." In the end, the Egyptian lands, with the exclusion of the temple priests, were all owned by Pharaoh, and the Egyptians literally became Pharaoh's servants. Well, as we near the end of the book of Genesis, Israel is nearing the end of his life. Joseph brings his two sons into Jacob for patriarchal blessings. Joseph performs the symbolic act of bringing his sons from between the knees of Jacob. This symbolic act represents Joseph's sons' new status as literal sons of Israel, sons of Jacob. So Joseph took both boys and faced them towards Jacob, Manasseh on the left, towards Israel's right hand, and Ephraim on the right, towards Israel's left hand. But in giving the blessings, Israel crossed his hands. President Joseph Fielding Smith said, "Showing favor to the right hand is not something invented by man, but revealed from heaven in the beginning. The right hand is a symbol of righteousness and used in making covenants." Well, with this act, Ephraim and Manasseh would now be numbered among the 12 tribes of Israel. The tribes in order are, and they're not in order here, this just shows you who the mother was of each of these individuals, but the tribes in order are Reuben and Simeon, and then you have the tribe of Levi. Now, Levi is not going to be given a heritage of territory. His heritage is going to be the priesthood itself, which he will then minister throughout the cities of Israel. And then you have Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, and then you have Joseph and Benjamin. But representing Joseph is going to be his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, the 12 tribes. Israel then brings his sons in for their final blessings prior to his death. Now, we've already discussed the first three and the poor choices that they made. Reuben, thou shalt not excel. Simeon and Levi, you are instruments of cruelty. Surprisingly, Judah does not hear about his personal sins. In fact, he's told that eventually he'll attain a status of leadership. Doctrine and Covenants, section 133, verse 35, it states, "And they also of the tribe of Judah, after their pain, shall be sanctified in holiness before the Lord, to dwell in his presence day and night forever and ever." Dan shall be judges. Naphtali, given goodly words. Gad, he shall overcome at the last. Asher, his bread shall be fat. Issachar, strong as an ass. Zebulun, he shall dwell at the haven of the sea. And then you come to Joseph's blessings. Joseph's blessings will extend to the uttermost bounds of the everlasting hills. Only in North America can we find a match for the geographical designation of everlasting hills. President Joseph Fielding Smith taught the phrase uttermost bound of the everlasting hills refers to the Western Hemisphere. The Lord gave America as an everlasting possession to Joseph, son of Jacob. His posterity, when cleansed from sin, and when they come forth in the resurrection, shall inherit this part of the earth. This shall be theirs forever. And then, of course, lastly, you have Benjamin. Benjamin's posterity would be fighters. In fact, Israel's King Saul and the Apostle Paul are descendants of Benjamin. So Jacob, or Israel, dies at the age of 147. As is Egyptian custom, Israel was embalmed over a 40-day period of time, followed by 70 days of mourning. From here, a great entourage made the journey to the cave and field of Machpelah. That's in Hebron. Now, this entourage included Joseph and all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of the land of Egypt, and all the house of Joseph and his brethren. Quote, "And there went up with them both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. And when the inhabitants of the land saw the mourning, they said, This is a grievous mourning to the Egyptians." And Joseph returned to Egypt. Now we come to chapter 50. The last chapter of Genesis is partial. Part of it is non-existent in the King James Version of the Bible. The Joseph Smith translation of chapter 50 gives us 15 lost verses. Consider the following. Joseph testified that the Lord visited him. Joseph was promised a future seer and prophet would deliver his people out of Egypt, and the man's name would be Moses. Joseph saw the scattering of his people. Joseph saw the coming of the Messiah. Joseph saw a branch of Israelites in America. Joseph saw another choice seer named Joseph. Joseph saw that this other seer would bring his people to God. Now let me return to that initial comment I made at the very beginning of our podcast. Today, we're going to explore the story of the last favored patriarch, Joseph of Canaan. Joseph, the first son of Rachel, the 11th son of Jacob or Israel, lived 93 years in the land of the pyramids, tombs, and pharaohs. Can you imagine the mourning, the ceremonial pomp, and the pageantry that had to take place at the death of this great man? The record indicates that Joseph died at the age of 110. He was embalmed and put into a coffin in Egypt. And then from the Joseph Smith translation of verse 38 of chapter 50, "So Joseph was 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and they put him in a coffin in Egypt. And he was kept from burial by the children of Israel, that he might be carried up and laid in the sepulchre with his father. And thus they remembered the oath which they sware unto him." What archaeological evidences do we have that Joseph ever existed in Egypt? Let's begin with the Kusebek inscription. They date to the 19th century BC at Abydos, Egypt. This is a first-person account of Kusebek, who's a servant of Pharaoh. He's described as an individual just serving in the lower echelon of Pharaoh's government, but somehow Pharaoh takes notice of this individual and elevates him to a high position within the government. A large memorial was erected in his honor. Now, this story has overtones and sounds very similar to our Joseph of Egypt. Now, a number of scholars place our Joseph story, as we have mentioned, within the time frame of 1700 to 1550 BC. This is a period when nomadic immigrants from Syria and Canaan settled in the Nile Delta. Eventually, they controlled the lower portion of Egypt, pushing the Egyptians south. These nomadic people are referred to as Hyksos, meaning desert princes. They are also known as shepherd kings. The Hyksos pharaohs introduced the horse-drawn chariot. We talked about that earlier in Genesis 41, verse 43. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, bow the knee, and they made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. Well, because the Hyksos pharaohs were Semitic, with ties to Canaan, they were welcome someone like Joseph, a young talented man, into their administration. With all that Joseph accomplished, one would think that it would be some kind of archaeological relic attesting to his reign. Now, this is kind of an interesting thought. Avaris is the Hyksos pharaoh's capital during the time of Joseph. That's the name of the city, Avaris. I've circled it on the slide. The question might be asked, was it named after our Joseph of Egypt? Professor Manfred Beitak has been digging at Tel El Daba in Egypt for 40 years, and he's identified it as Avaris, the ancient Hyksos pharaoh capital. Avaris is smack dab in the middle of the area the Bible calls Goshen, the area that the Israelites lived in prior to the Exodus. The word Avaris means actually nothing in Egyptian, but in the Torah, Joseph is repeatedly called a Hebrew, which is Evri in the Hebrew language. He is also referred to as the man, or Haish. In other words, Evri may very well be related to Joseph's Evri Haish, or the Hebrew man. The so-called Hyksos capital seems to have the name of Joseph, Evri Haish, or Avarish. Sound very, very similar. Between 1986 and 1988, Professor Beitak found the remains of a monumental statue that seems to belong to a non-Egyptian ruler of Avarish. Although only fragmented portions remain, the archaeologist estimates the original size of the seated figure to be 6.5 feet tall and 5 feet in depth. Over the statue's right shoulder, you can see his throw stick, the symbol of his rule. On the back, remarkably as with our biblical Joseph, you can still see evidence that this ruler was wearing a striped garment made up of at least 3 different colors, black, red, and white. The statue was found in a tomb, and the tomb was empty. Now, this may be the result of looting, but one can't help but recall that the biblical narrative explicitly tells us that the Israelites, when they left the Exodus, they took Joseph's bones with him, so the tomb would be empty. That's in Exodus 13:19. They call the statue Asiatic. He is not Egyptian. Rather, he is a man who comes from the area of Canaan. Now, not much is left of his face, because after his rule, as with our biblical Joseph, his people seem to have experienced a downfall. Basically, someone in ancient times took a hammer to his face. But his hairdo is still intact. They call this a mushroom hairdo, and it's specifically related to non-Egyptians from the area of ancient Canaan. The statue was found in a layer corresponding to the year of 1700 BC. The statue and this ruler perfectly fit the story of our biblical Joseph, who ruled at that particular time. After the Exodus, the question might be asked, where were Joseph's bones finally laid to rest? A site near Tel Balada, the site of biblical Shechem, is a traditional site identified as the resting place of the biblical patriarch Joseph and his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Multiple locations over the years, though, have been viewed as the legendary burial place of Joseph. However, post-biblical records regarding the location of Joseph's tomb, beginning about the 4th century A.D., indicate that Shechem was that location. Now, to summarize our evidences of Joseph in Egypt, I want to share with you a video that is entitled Strong Evidence of Joseph's Tomb and Palace in Egypt. It'll highlight many of the things I've just alluded to.
A famine would have meant that there were many key decisions he would have made in order to protect Egypt and save his Pharaoh's skin. A man who steers his people and his king through great adversity might expect a big reward. So, did Joseph get one? As a reward for his achievements, Joseph asks Pharaoh if his family can settle in Egypt. The Bible says Joseph and his brothers settled in a city called Ramesses. But archaeologists surveying the area could find no trace of the city. Then, in the 1970s, a farmer found the first remarkable clue, the remains of a colossal statue. Archaeologist Irina Forster-Muller thinks the statue proves that this was the site of the city mentioned in the Bible.
Ramses the Great, Ramses II, who is one of the most important kings of the New Kingdom. This is the area of Ramesses, his capital. It was a huge city in this time. We have here the statue, and we know we have a temple over there, and several other temples and villas.
The find raised hopes that this was where Joseph had settled and was reunited with his brothers. But these hopes were dashed when archaeologists established that Ramesses was built 300 years after Joseph's time. In addition, there was no sign of a Semitic presence at all. But inscriptions were then discovered suggesting that Ramesses was built on top of an older city called Avaris. If they could find it, then maybe they could find Joseph. Then they found it. Excavations are gradually revealing the secrets of Avaris. It was built 300 years before Ramesses, just when Joseph was thought to have lived. And its ruins revealed tantalizing clues. Although most of the buildings were Egyptian in style, one area was distinctly Canaanite. But the most compelling evidence of a Semitic presence came from inside the houses. These bodies were found buried in sideways postures, a typically Canaanite tradition. And objects found inside the burial pits left archaeologists in no doubt.
We have a lot of Canaanite shapes, like the jugs here, combined with Egyptian shapes, like the small vessel here. We find sometimes weapons attached to the tombs, like this sword. It's made of bronze. And then with the same tomb comes a belt in very fragile condition, which the male burial had around his hip. So we have always the mixture of both cultures.
These finds are consistent with the Bible's claim that Semites settled in the Nile Delta. But only poor Semites, perhaps slaves. None of it indicated someone of Joseph's status, a high-ranking pharaonic official of Semitic origin, lived there. But further finds at Avaris suggest that archaeologists are closing in on that elusive evidence. The excavations have since returned to agricultural use, but there are extensive plans and photos. David Roll, a specialist in biblical and ancient history, examined, then reconstructed part of the site.
To the north of where they have their dig house, they started digging in a flat field of wheat. They didn't expect to find very much, but just under the surface they found these remarkable finds. A beautiful villa, which is the quality of a palace. In fact, it probably is a palace, but it's not of a king. It's not a palace of a king. Reconstructed, you can see how complex it is. There are various elements to it built at different times. It had 12 columns along its colonnade, and that's a significant number in the Bible.
This small palace looked like the home of a high-ranking official. But it was a find at the back of the palace that most intrigued archaeologists. A tomb topped with a pyramid.
The tomb was over there, to the south of the palace, and one of the most interesting tombs was that of a dignitary with a tomb chapel. And inside this tomb chapel we found the rest of a tomb statue.
The statue had been vandalized, but when reassembled, it shocked the experts. This could not have been the statue of an Egyptian official.
When we get it back to the museum and restore it, it looks like this. And you can see that the head's been completely smashed, the lower part of the head, and the eyes have been gouged out. The most important thing is this. It's an amazing haircut. We don't see anything like that in Egypt before this time. And the hair colour is bright red. This guy had flame red hair.
The details were typical of Semitic people.
Another little detail is the skin colour. Here we can see the forehead, and this here is yellow skin, and that's typical of what the Egyptians did to represent foreigners from the north, people with pale skin.
It wasn't just on the hair and face that paint was found. Flakes of red and black paint were found on the outline of a garment, and with it a distinctive pattern. Could this be a multicolored coat? Could this be Joseph? The absence of a nameplate means there's no way of knowing, but for David Roll, there are no other contenders.
We have no other example of something quite as extraordinary as this. We have no pyramid tomb for an official of state. We have no other palace for a private individual. These sort of things are things reserved for royalty, usually. So this is extraordinary. We have no other examples to compare it to. But if you're trying to imagine the rewards of somebody who gave such service to Egypt, who saved it from the famine, you would expect these type of things to be given.
Most Egyptian tombs were stripped of treasures such as furniture, clothes, and jewelry. This tomb was no exception, but in this case, the bones were also taken away.
If a plunderer had gone in there to wreck the tomb, he would have left the bones behind. He wouldn't have taken the bones away. Bones don't have any intrinsic value. So somebody's removed the body from this tomb. Now, the story of Joseph is, at the time of Exodus, where Moses takes the Israelites out of Egypt, he takes the coffin of Joseph with him, so he would have left an empty tomb. So here we have a guy with a multicoloured coat with an empty tomb. It's got to be Joseph.
And the Joseph story is important for that reason, providing the link to the Exodus. Joseph brought the Israelites into Egypt. Moses took them out during his journey, receiving the 10 Commandments and the foundation of a moral code for Jewish, Christian, and Muslim peoples. But 1,000 years separates the writing of the Joseph story from when it was supposed to have happened. It is likely that the story was embellished in places for religious reasons. Despite all this, the balance of evidence does suggest that someone like Joseph, a complete outsider, could have risen to the top of one of the world's greatest civilizations.
How great would it have been for the prophet Joseph Smith to have been able to translate some of the book of Joseph. You know, Genesis chapter 50, with its 15 new verses, gives us a little glimpse of what it might have contained had the prophet Joseph Smith been able to translate some of the book of Joseph. I want to thank you for joining us today in our presentation on Joseph of Egypt. Our next presentation will cover the Exodus. In fact, we'll cover Exodus chapters 1 through 13. Thanks again for joining us, and don't forget to press the like button.